Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's video chat about what IBD patients and caregivers need to know about the COVID-19 vaccines. My name is Catherine Soto, and I am the Director of Patient Education and Support for the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. Over the past 2 weeks, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has issued emergency use approval for 2 COVID-19 vaccines. As the vaccines begin to be delivered across the country, we know that you have a lot of questions about the vaccines and IBD. I'm pleased to be joined tonight by 2 leading experts, Dr. David Rubin of the University of Chicago Medicine and Dr. Jami Kinnucan of Michigan Medicine. Over the next 45 minutes or so, Drs. Rubin and Kinnucan will answer your questions about the COVID-19 vaccine and IBD. Dr. Rubin and Dr. Kinnucan, thanks for joining us tonight.
Very happy to be here. Thanks, Kat.
Yeah, thank you, Kat, and the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation for making this such a priority to get information out there.
Great. Well, before we get started, a few pieces of housekeeping. The information provided during tonight's chat is meant for educational purposes only. It should not replace any advice you receive from your gastroenterologist, nutritionist, or surgeon. If you have questions about your specific care, please reach out to your healthcare provider. Tonight's chat is going to be focused on the COVID-19 vaccines and IBD. If you have other questions regarding IBD, we won't be able to get to them. Please call the IBD Help Center at info@crohnscolitisfoundation.org or 888-MY-GUT-PAIN with any questions you may have. We want to give a big thank you to the sponsors of the Foundation's COVID-19 Resource Center, AbbVie, Genentech, Gilead Sciences, Janssen Pharmaceuticals, Medtronic, the Pfizer Foundation, and Takeda Pharmaceuticals. Additional support is provided through the Foundation's annual giving program. Lastly, if you're watching, please comment below and let us know who you are and where you're from. With all of that out of the way, let's jump in. Dr. Rubin, the COVID-19 vaccine seems to have been quickly turned around. However, I understand that the mRNA vaccines, which the COVID-19 vaccines are not new. Can you explain what an mRNA vaccine is?
Thanks, Kat. So many people are asking, was the vaccine developed too quickly to know whether it's as effective or safe as we think that it is? And the answer is actually that the messenger RNA technology for thinking about treatment or vaccine development is not new. That's been around for a long time and in development. And in fact, a messenger RNA vaccine against the first SARS, which was in 2002, the severe acute respiratory syndrome from a different coronavirus, started 17 years ago. And so this was in development. And in fact, the target of that vaccine was the same as what they've now targeted with SARS-CoV-2, the more recent coronavirus, the one that has, of course, caused COVID-19 and our existing pandemic. The way a messenger RNA vaccine works is that RNA is a component of our genetic code, and RNA is one step before a protein is made by our body. So the way messenger RNA works is that this is actually coding for the protein that makes up those little spikes that are on the coronavirus. Everyone's seen the cartoons of this particular virus that have all those little spikes sticking out of it. It's called a coronavirus because those little spikes make it look like the sun. And the spike protein is the target for our immune system to eradicate the virus, or at least to limit its replication in our body. So what happens is this little strand of RNA is encoded in what are called lipid nanoparticles, really small fat droplets that are taken into our cells, have no impact on the nucleus or on the DNA of our cells, which is completely separate, but it ends up using the machinery within cells to make that protein, and our body then has an immune reaction against that spike protein. So the way the mechanism works is by using this strand to stimulate a protein that looks like the surface of the virus. It has nothing to do with active virus. It could not cause COVID or an infection with the coronavirus. The messenger RNA degrades quickly. In fact, the reason it has to be kept cold is because it's something that will degrade quickly if not refrigerated. But in our bodies, it also only lasts a couple days and then it's completely gone. So the mechanism makes sense. It's not new. It was developed quickly during this pandemic because the government enabled companies to eliminate some of the risk they would normally be incurring from a financial point of view. And therefore, they were able to push this ahead and move right into production at the same time they were actually doing their large trials. But the need for effectiveness and safety was not changed. And therefore, we do have what we need to understand how this works. And we'll get into some of the other details about that. But hopefully that's reassuring, at least about the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines and what this particular mechanism is.
That's very helpful. And I think you're kind of leading into my next question, which is, can you explain what emergency use approval means? And when will these vaccines receive full approval by the FDA?
Thanks. So the emergency use authorization is a status that the FDA can give to a therapy or to a vaccine or to some other intervention when they have assessed, number one, that there's an emergency, and number two, that the benefits outweigh the risks. And in the case of these two vaccines, it was determined that they obviously were in an emergency, but also that the benefits far outweighed the risks that were determined. The reason it's distinct from FDA approval is because the long-term follow-up, the additional safety that was built into these trials, which are designed to be 2 years long, will be longer than they needed in order to make that initial assessment of benefit over risk. And that's why they initially give an emergency use authorization, which enables us to actually use it. And ultimately, it will gain approval after they've completed the full study with that longer follow-up. The natural question people are going to want to know is, are we cutting corners on safety by doing it this way? And the short answer is, we don't think so. But the longer answer is, of course, we want to know more about this. But I want to emphasize what I started with, which is that we actually know a lot about the mRNA technology. And we're very comfortable with what we're seeing and what we know about it from before and what we know about it now. And I want to remind everyone that it wasn't just these two vaccine trials that occurred in all those many thousands of patients. It was actually the smaller trials that were done in volunteers before those trials as well. And those people have been followed out. And just to emphasize another point, the number of patients included in both Moderna and Pfizer were 30 to 40,000 patients. The number of patients that are usually used to study a new influenza vaccine, which comes out every year, is only 10,000. So they intentionally recruited many more people so that they could look for any small signals of safety or concerns. And fortunately, we haven't seen those, and we're very reassured by all of that.
That's very helpful to know. Dr. Kinnucan, let me pose this question to you. Just to clarify, are the COVID-19 vaccines live vaccines, and are they safe for IBD patients to get?
Kat, that's a great question. I think that Dr. Rubin did an excellent job. Actually, probably the best explanation I've heard of what mRNA is and how the vaccine actually works. But as he explained, that this does not contain live replicating virus. And so this is a protein that's meant to look like the spike protein, or I'm sorry, it's mRNA that's meant to look like the spike protein to induce an immune response. So there are no live components of either of the vaccines that have been approved through the emergency authorization or emergency use authorization. In terms of the safety and effectiveness, Dr. Rubin, I think you touched on these as well, is that there was rigorous safety and effectiveness similar to all other types of vaccines that have been approved for use in the United States. The clinical trial program, again, enrolled 30 to 40,000 in each program, at least for each vaccine that's been approved. And while we don't have specific data in IBD patients, as IBD patients were excluded from these clinical trial programs, what we believe from a safety and an effectiveness standpoint is that we would recommend that patients with IBD do get these vaccines, irregardless of the current treatment that they're on for their inflammatory bowel disease. As we start to vaccinate more healthcare providers, especially some colleagues nationally that have inflammatory bowel disease, as well as patients with inflammatory bowel disease in the coming months, the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, along with IBD partners, is going to start looking at the effectiveness in IBD patients. There is no concern about the safety of the vaccination, but there might be a reduction in effectiveness that we may see, or we actually see that it's the same effectiveness as the general population that was studied.
Great. And what are the differences between the two available COVID-19 vaccines? Is one better for IBD patients than the other? And are there potential side effects of each?
Those are great questions. So the two currently available COVID-19 vaccines are one from Pfizer, which was the first one that received the emergency use authorization. And then the second one, most recently in the last week, the Moderna vaccination. Both vaccinations that have been approved use the mRNA technology. So both have the similar mechanism as Dr. Rubin so nicely reviewed for us. And so because they use a similar technology, they have similar expected side effects. I always remind my patients that when they have side effects related to vaccines, whether it's some soreness at their arm or they have some mild muscle aches or even a low-grade fever, that this is actually a sign that their immune system is doing what it's supposed to do, which is generate immunity to the vaccine. The most common reported side effects, and I can speak to that as I was vaccinated, very fortunately yesterday, is soreness at the injection site. I've still got my Band-Aid on. As well as some redness at the injection site, which are the most common side effects that patients can experience. But other participants within the clinical trial programs reported fevers, headaches, and muscle aches. But typically these side effects last no more than 24 to 72 hours after receiving the vaccine. We do see that patients were more likely to experience side effects after the second dose as opposed to the first dose. We also want to point out that there is some discussion around patients who have a history of allergies or maybe even anaphylaxis to whether it's medications or other allergens in the environment. These patients we should consider special precaution with. Oftentimes within the vaccination programs is that they're being monitored for longer. But this is a discussion if a patient out there does have severe allergies or anaphylaxis, even some of our IBD therapies, to talk with their healthcare provider of whether or not this particular vaccine is the right vaccine for them. As we do have future vaccines coming, including the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which we expect to be available in the coming months.
Great, thank you, Jami. As a follow-up, Dr. Rubin, you were talking a little bit about the time frame of the development of these vaccines. Can you explain, with the shortened time frame for clinical trials and expedited approval process, what do we know about the long-term side effects? How concerned should IBD patients be about the long-term effects of the vaccine?
Well, it's important to ask that question, and obviously we're going to follow out people. The most important question we're trying to make sure we understand is how long will the immunity last? And a related question is, if you had COVID and you developed antibodies against the coronavirus, is that sufficient and do you not need a vaccine? And the reason I bring that up is because even if you've had COVID, the amount of immunity you may develop and how long it lasts may be significantly less than what the vaccine is designed to trigger in your body. So that's a very important question. And one of the most important things that we really want to know in long-term follow-up is how long does it last? In terms of unexpected safety, I want to point out to you that the main difference with the messenger RNA vaccines is how it triggers the making of that protein. Remember, I mentioned that the messenger RNA goes away. And so that is not still in your body doing anything after just even a couple days. And that protein that's made, anytime your body sees a foreign protein, it develops an immune response to it. So people want to know appropriately, is this going to trigger another type of immune response? Like, will it activate my IBD? Remember that IBD, Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis are conditions where your immune response is either being continuously stimulated by something we haven't found yet, or has lost its ability to control itself, so it's continuing to go. And so it's been asked before with other vaccines, does vaccination either cause IBD or exacerbate IBD? And there's been a lot of work done to show in every study that vaccines do not cause IBD and vaccines do not exacerbate IBD. Similarly, the messenger RNA causing a protein that will stimulate our immune response against the coronavirus is not expected to exacerbate IBD. We're not anticipating those side effects or adverse events to develop later. And I want to emphasize what Jami very nicely said. What Dr. Kinnucan pointed out was that these vaccines are designed to be reactogenic. You are supposed to have some reaction to them. That's your body doing its job. And you feel that. The first injection is called the prime, where your body will first see the protein, or maybe you've already had COVID and it'll be an exposure to the protein again. And the second dose, the reason these are 2-dose vaccines, is called the booster. And the booster is when your body really revs up. And it's developing an immune response that we see with other vaccines from other technologies. The influenza vaccine, the pneumonia vaccine, the human papillomavirus vaccine, the shingles vaccine, all those vaccines using different techniques want to stimulate the exact same response in our bodies. So we know enough to reassure our patients with IBD, as we're recommending they get vaccinated, that they should not expect that their IBD is going to get worse. And likewise, we're learning enough about those who have histories of allergic reactions. If you had an allergic reaction to your anti-TNF therapy for your Crohn's or colitis, for example, that is different than the allergic reaction that we're talking about with the vaccine. It's predominantly people who've had an allergic reaction to polyethylene glycol, which is the same thing that's in your colonoscopy preps. And so the people who are listening in all have had colonoscopies, and it's exceptionally rare that you would have had an allergic reaction to that awful prep. You've had a lot of reactions to those preps, but not an allergic reaction. So that's the type of reaction we're talking about. People with food allergies, people with allergies to other medications that have been previously described, even people who have other types of allergies, including peanut allergies and other things in the environment, are not people that should necessarily be at all worried about having an allergic reaction to this vaccine. And as Dr. Kinnucan mentioned, we monitor people for 15 to 30 minutes after they get the injection, because that's when we would see something happening. So overall, we're not trying to sugarcoat this. I think we actually know quite a bit, and that's why it's so important to have this dialogue tonight and try to address some of these concerns so that people are going to be reassured.
I absolutely agree with that. And Dr. Kinnucan, so how long does it take for the COVID-19 vaccine to become effective? Is it after the first dose or the second dose?
That's great. And that builds on what Dr. Rubin just talked about. So both approved vaccines currently require 2 doses. The Pfizer vaccination is the first dose, and then 21 days later, you receive the second dose. And the Moderna vaccine is the first dose, and then 28 days later, you receive the second dose. The greatest effectiveness of the vaccine is after that second dose, the booster dose that Dr. Rubin was talking about, where we see that effectiveness rate of over 90% if you combine both of the vaccines together. However, after the first dose, they did see that patients could have or participants in the clinical trial could have up to a 52% reduction in their risk at that point. So immunity is building early with that primer dose, but it really takes that second dose, and very important for patients to make sure that they sign up for that second dose. The other thing is, if you miss your second dose, do you have to restart, which is a question that comes up. And right now, the recommendations are that you get 2 doses, even if it's a little bit delayed outside of that 21 or 28 days. I think that the most important thing for patients, to consider is even within the first couple of weeks after their first dose, or even the weeks and years leading up after their second dose, that we still need to be practicing diligence in terms of social distancing, what the CDC is recommending, wearing a mask in indoor gatherings, ensuring that, staying within, a single household or pod, things that are actually, known to be effective to reduce transmission of virus even after receiving the vaccine. And that may change, those recommendations may change as we develop, a broader immunity within the community. But as of right now, early on, we're still practicing all the things that we've been doing, over the last 9 months.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that point that Dr. Kinnucan made. The important thing to understand is the vaccine and the immunity you gain from it will prevent you from having severe COVID-19. And it was shown to be 100% effective at preventing that level of COVID-19. So that's great news. But so far, we don't know that it prevents you from getting infected or infecting others. So you can still have the virus in your body, especially as Dr. Kinnucan mentioned, it's happening in your community at high levels. You could still be carrying it. There are some early data from Pfizer and Moderna to suggest that it might reduce transmission. In other words, you might be a carrier, but it doesn't let the virus replicate, and therefore you won't spread it as much as we had previously worried, but we don't know that for sure yet. So until we know that we've actually tamped this down and shut off the pandemic, even those who are vaccinated need to be wary of actually becoming infected and unknowingly transmit it to other people. Remember that one of the reasons we're in the situation we're in right now is because this particular coronavirus has an asymptomatic carrier state where people can transmit it before they know they have the condition, let alone those who have symptoms and are ignoring them. But that's why we need to be extra careful and continue to remind everyone until we get this across the community and until we watch the world actually quiet down, we're going to need to continue being careful. And believe me, I understand how tired we are of hearing those messages, but they work. Actually, the practices of wearing masks and physically distancing work. And we just have to keep our heads down and focus until we get through this. And I think that we're going to see that downturn over the next 3 to 6 months. We just have to keep working on this.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. And I want to go back to some of the discussion you had started on earlier, but I think it's important to underscore here. What's the potential that the COVID-19 vaccine could cause a disease flare or an inflammatory response in IBD patients? And is there data on the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine for people who have suppressed immune systems?
Thank you for asking that. And I understand that's very concerning and something people want to know about. As I hinted at and mentioned before, with other vaccines, we have not seen IBD activate. We do not expect that this vaccine will do that either. There's no reason to believe that based on the type of immune response that we're trying to trigger with the vaccine. In regards to the therapies people are on, let me start by refreshing everybody's understanding of this. The treatments we use for inflammatory bowel disease ideally are turning down an overactive immune response is what's driving your Crohn's disease or your ulcerative colitis. Ideally, the treatments we use to treat Crohn's and colitis are not immune suppressing you. And in fact, our newer therapies, many of them are targeting specific components of our immune system, and they're not immune suppressing you. So I want to point out, first of all, just a matter of language. The only thing that we feel is immunosuppressive is high doses of steroids and some combinations of therapies. And I understand that that's some of our patients out there and people who might be listening right now. But I want to make it clear that most inflammatory bowel disease patients on our modern therapies are not immune suppressed. They have a modified immune system. So then the next part of this is that what do we know about their risk for COVID and bad outcomes from COVID? Well, in international registries and other single center and single country reports, the IBD population as a whole has not been at higher risk for infection or at higher risk for bad outcomes from COVID. That doesn't mean they're at lower risk either, though. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. The main thing that Dr. Kinnucan mentioned is that we anticipate that if you're on prednisone at doses higher than 20 milligrams, or if you're on combination therapies with the thiopurines, which is azathioprine or 6-MP with your anti-TNF drugs, many patients are on those combination therapies, you may have a blunted immune response. That means that the vaccine may not work as well as it does in someone who's not on those therapies. That doesn't mean it doesn't work at all. And we're extrapolating that piece of information from the studies that were done with the pneumonia vaccine and with the influenza vaccine. We don't know actually. We think that the messenger RNA vaccine may be so effective that it's going to overcome some of those limitations, but we don't have that information yet. So the message for our IBD patients, and there's now an international consensus that will be coming out in the next week of world experts who got together to say this, and I can share a part of that with you, is that IBD patients should get the vaccine when it's available to them, and they should follow up with their healthcare team to ask other questions if they have them, but they shouldn't be worried that their IBD is going to get worse. They should know that overall, we very strongly believe benefits outweigh any risks, and we're confident that this is going to go well for our population. In terms of what the CDC is advising through their Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the ACIP, they're the ones who recommended we start with healthcare workers and those in long-term care facilities like nursing homes, and now essential workers. The people in the United States who have chronic conditions, which includes inflammatory bowel disease, are in that next group, which is like 110 million Americans. And so our patients will be able to get the vaccine, we hope, within the next couple months. And when your time comes, I hope that you'll take advantage of it and get it. And this is reassuring to you. By then, by the way, we're going to have more information, because there's lots of healthcare workers who have inflammatory bowel disease, and they're getting their vaccines right now. I know, because some of them are my patients and some of them are Dr. Kinnucan's patients and colleagues. So we certainly will have some more information for you, but overall the world's experts are coming together and are unified in their recommendation for our patients.
That's a great segue to the next question, which I'll pose to you, Dr. Kinnucan. It's something we've been hearing patients ask. If you have IBD and tested positive for COVID-19 in the past, should you still receive the vaccine? Why or why not?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that Dr. Rubin covered this earlier, but it is currently recommended with a history of COVID that you would receive the vaccine, that you should and you can receive the vaccine. The only caveat to that is if you recently tested positive for COVID or were exposed to somebody with COVID, you should complete your quarantine period as recommended by the CDC prior to getting vaccination. Some of the literature that's out there that you'll see is that in patients who were recently infected with COVID-19, they may have some form of immunity for a period of time. And if they wanted to defer, they could defer up to 90 days, but they do not have to. And so many of my patients that have recently had COVID-19 are healthcare workers and have the opportunity to get the vaccination after their quarantine period. I am recommending that they receive the vaccination.
Yeah, and
I think Dr. Rubin would agree.
I do agree, and I'll just share personally that, as some of you know, my son had COVID in March, and even donated his plasma to give his antibodies to someone else, or to be part of a study to do that. And then in September had his antibodies rechecked and they were gone. So as I mentioned, people who had the infection, maybe they had a less severe version of it, or maybe the immunity that it stimulates is a slightly modified version. It may not be as strong or as lasting. So we do recommend that people get the vaccine even if they've had COVID.
So let's talk a little bit about special IBD populations and the vaccine for the next few questions. So Dr. Rubin, I'll start with you. Can pediatric patients receive the vaccine, and when do we anticipate approval will occur for pediatric patients?
Right. So the emergency use authorization includes those who are 16 and older because they were included in the trials. So keep in mind that when we talk about pediatrics in general, we're usually saying 18 or under. So there is that group of teenagers that were at least in the trial, and we know that this was safe and effective in them. The pediatricians are suggesting that we would like to know more. And because kids are at lower risk for bad outcomes, but can be carriers and transmit the virus, that we are still recommending that they get vaccinated when it becomes available. But we're waiting for some more information about that. So it's important for people to stay tuned. There will be more recommendations to help us understand how to do this when it's possible.
And Dr. Kinnucan, what about pregnant or breastfeeding women with IBD? What should they know about the vaccine, and is it safe for them to get?
Kat, this is a great question, and I've seen a lot of things come around in the last couple of weeks as now we have 2 vaccines that have been approved. So ultimately, what we do from an IBD community is look for guidance from our American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, so ACOG for short, because ultimately pregnant patients and breastfeeding patients were not included in the clinical trials. Similarly to IBD patients were not included in the clinical trials. The recommendations coming out from ACOG are that the decision is left up to the patient as well as their healthcare team. And they are recommending that if patients wanted to get vaccinated, if they were pregnant or breastfeeding, that they should get vaccinated to the COVID-19 vaccine. I do have several colleagues that have been fortunate enough to be vaccinated who are pregnant. And I've had several colleagues that are breastfeeding that have felt very comfortable moving forward to get the vaccine, as the concerns are that we are learning that pregnant patients not pregnant patients with IBD, but pregnant patients in general who may get infected with COVID-19 may be at risk for more severe outcomes than patients who are not pregnant. So even something else to consider. Another common question that kind of comes up along with pregnancy and breastfeeding is about fertility. So some of my patients in my practice have asked, because they are considering getting pregnant in the coming months, is should they avoid getting pregnant after vaccination? And as of right now, we believe that patients should get vaccination when it becomes available to them, and they should not delay trying to get pregnant in the general population. And when we talk about IBD patients, we of course want to make sure that their disease is in remission, they've been taking their prenatal vitamins, they've spoken with their gastroenterologist about their plans to become pregnant, and if they decide to get the vaccine, and then of course working together with their healthcare team to decide the timing of pregnancy planning related to their IBD. Those are some of the questions that we're seeing in clinical practice now related to pregnancy, breastfeeding, and then of course questions about getting pregnant in general.
The one area, Kat,
Yep,
where people are recommending just delaying the vaccine is if you just got over COVID, as I think Dr. Kinnucan hinted. And the second area would be if you've had a recent other vaccine. So we don't want to stack the vaccines. Sometimes we do give multiple vaccinations at the same time, but because this is new, we don't want to confuse one response with another or one side effect with another. So that's where we're actually pacing people or separating things out. But there are some different regional thoughts about all this, and I agree completely with what Dr. Kinnucan said.
And what about, Dr. Rubin, patients who have ostomies, a J pouch, or recent surgery? Should there be any concerns there?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, because too often those important patients are not included in these conversations. And back in the early days of the pandemic, we wanted to specifically address our ostomates and our patients who have J pouches. And there's no specific worry for them that's different than anything else. And we do recommend they get vaccinated and take care of themselves and do exactly what we're recommending for everybody.
Wonderful. Okay. IBD patients are treated with a variety of different medications. So, Dr. Rubin, what should patients know about their medications and the vaccine? Just underscore for us what you've some guidance there. And are all IBD medications safe to be on while receiving the vaccine?
Right. Let me start with the last part first, which is that we believe that all the medicines that you need for your inflammatory bowel disease, whether we're talking about the oral immunomodulators or the monoclonal antibody biological therapies, or even antibiotics and mesalamine, the 5-ASA drugs, or even steroids, are safe to receive the vaccine. So none of these are expected to make you have a bad reaction to the vaccine. The question we have is whether any of these might blunt your body's ability to develop an immune response with the memory B cells, the part of your immune system that actually is going to remember the spike protein and be able to mount an attack if you get exposed to the coronavirus now or in the future. So we know from older data with the pneumonia vaccine and with the influenza vaccine that when you're on steroids, it blunts your body's ability to mount a full immune response. That doesn't mean you don't have any. It means that some people have a blunted response. We also know from older data that thiopurines, which is azathioprine or 6-MP, may also blunt that immune response. However, we have some emerging data with a newer vaccine that some of you may have heard of for shingles called Shingrix. That vaccine is so potent that it seems to overcome some of those limitations, and it's been studied in patients receiving chemotherapy for cancer where their immune system may be blunted or reduced significantly. And that particular vaccine triggers a very robust immune response. So it's not just about what therapies you're on, whether your body can mount immunity. It's also about the design of the vaccine itself. But there's nothing about our current therapies we use to treat your IBD that should make you worried you're at higher risk for any adverse events that we know of with this new vaccine. And it's based on very good information over all the years that we've been understanding vaccinations in our patients with inflammatory bowel disease. There is one group that has a reduced immune response unrelated to therapies. If you actually broke down the Pfizer and the Moderna studies, you'll see that People who were older, and what I mean by that is those who are older than 65 and certainly older than 75, actually have a blunted immune response. They still have significant immunity, over 85% or 80%, but not the 90% plus that Dr. Kinnucan mentioned. And that's because as you age, your immune system actually quiets down. Many people have an immune system that becomes senescent or develops senescence, which means that it's not as robust. That's why older patients are more likely to get pneumonia, for example. Their immune system doesn't fight the way it used to. It's also why in the early days when we were describing what we call elderly onset IBD, so people who are older who develop inflammatory bowel disease, that in general we thought they had milder types of IBD. And for the most part, that's still true, that even when they have IBD, it's a little bit less severe, but there are always exceptions to that. So it's not the therapy necessarily, it may be the age of the patient or other things. And none of these different categories make us worry about adverse events. It's just about seeing how robust the immune response we can get. It naturally lends itself to this other part, which is what about your non-inflammatory bowel disease family members living in the same house as you? Should they get vaccinated? And when should they get vaccinated? And the short answer is, yeah, they should get vaccinated, and they should get it when it's available to them, so that everyone's starting to get this. And we want it to spread through our community. And we want to address people's concerns or fears about this by speaking about the science and the facts, and that we know an awful lot about this. And I think the fact that healthcare workers have been getting this first and upfront and very publicly should be sending a very positive message to our patients, and that we're confident in the data and we're confident in what we're trying to do to help each other and to help you.
I appreciate both of you sharing that you recently received the vaccine, and Dr. Kinnucan even showing us the remnants of that. Can I ask, how are you feeling after receiving it?
Sure, David, do you want to go first? You got yours first.
I got mine on Friday, and I had a sore arm on Saturday, and maybe a little headache, although it's hard to say because I was teaching on Saturday morning, and it might have been that. But it didn't last long at all, and I was fine by Sunday. I'm expecting for the booster dose that I'm going to have more, I hope actually that I'm going to have more events and feel it, because that means my body's reacting to it properly.
Yeah, and I felt the same. I was lucky enough to get vaccinated yesterday. So about 36 hours now later, other than some arm soreness and maybe a little bit of muscle aches overnight, certainly slept fine though. I wouldn't know that I had the vaccine. So again, I am also hoping to have a more maybe mild significant response to the second booster dose to gain that greater than 90% immunity to help protect our vulnerable patients.
Yeah, I'm going to shamelessly quote somebody from Twitter who posted that the #1 side effect of her boyfriend getting the COVID vaccine was that he can't stop telling people that he got the COVID vaccine. So obviously, in all seriousness, you know, our colleagues around the country are sharing their experiences, and it's been pretty uniform.
Yeah, so I think the excitement of it and all of us waiting for some kind of progress in this area is just so important and evident in everyone's emotions. So thank you for sharing that, both of you. Dr. Rubin, I'm going to pose this to you. The CDC has outlined a process by which people would be receiving or eligible to receive the vaccine. So will IBD patients be included in the high risk category? Why or why not?
Well, they're going to be included because patients with chronic immune conditions are just lumped in and included. And I think that's totally fine. You know, as I've said to my nursing team, who've been amazing during the pandemic, any of our patients who wanted a letter to support them working from home or being able to do the things they needed to get through this terrible time, we wanted to support in any way. But that's on the backdrop of what I said earlier, which is that we understand that patients with inflammatory bowel disease are not at higher risk for infection. They're not at higher risk for necessarily having bad outcomes from COVID either. But that's fine, it doesn't matter. The point is we want to get our entire population vaccinated as soon as we can. And we really definitely want to reassure people to get it when it's available. And what's going to need to happen, and we're working on it now here, and I know that Dr. Kinnucan's working on it at the University of Michigan, is that every provider and every medical center is going to need a system. How are we going to roll this out? so that we can get it to our patients and do it in a proper way. And also, frankly, to do it with the appropriate research and other registries to follow up everybody. So we're learning from this. And that's a very important component of that. So I'm going to just tell everyone out there that they should really, if they're offered the opportunity to be followed in a registry or to have your extra blood drawn to follow your antibody development, please say yes. You know, we want to get information, and I'd encourage you to be involved in this process. We're all in this together, and we're going to learn together.
Thank you. And Dr. Kinnucan, you had referenced some really great recommendations on what we can be doing. And I want to come back full circle to that. While patients are waiting to receive the vaccine, what can they be doing in the meantime to protect themselves?
And I think we touched on this in terms of continuing to be just really careful in terms of reducing our risk for exposure, physical distancing 6 feet, wearing a mask over your nose and your mouth. But also something that I think has been forgotten in this pandemic is that we still are at risk for influenza, and our patients are at risk for getting the flu. And many of my patients I found haven't received their vaccines for influenza like they normally would. So I would encourage our IBD patients listening today, or those that listen in follow-up, is that make sure you're vaccinated to influenza, so that when and if you're able to get the COVID-19 vaccine, that it's been several weeks since you received your influenza vaccine, so that you can appropriately get your COVID-19 vaccine. So I put a plug in for getting your flu shot. And getting it as soon as possible, because it does take several weeks to build immunity to the flu vaccine as well, and so you want to be protected in the coming weeks.
That's great advice. Thank you, Dr. Kinnucan. And actually, that's all the time we have for tonight's chat. Dr. Rubin, Dr. Kinnucan, thank you so much for joining. Do you have any final words or anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
I just want to thank the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation for doing this, and actually remind folks that there's an incredible web resource that the foundation has been made available throughout the pandemic, but has been updated recently with additional information about the vaccines. So you can learn more about it there. And I want to certainly reassure everyone that we're going to get through this together. We just have to continue to stay vigilant a bit longer, and we will get there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll echo what Dr. Rubin said. I feel very honored to be a part of this, as well as the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation COVID-19 educational resource task force, and how fast we were able to get some vaccine information out to the IBD population. And again, I want to encourage everyone, when the vaccine does become available to you, to get that vaccine if you're able. I think it'll be so important for us to be able to build that herd immunity moving forward when we start to vaccinate more of the population. So thank you so much for having me tonight, and want to wish everyone out there, whatever they celebrate, a happy holiday.
Absolutely. And I want to take a chance to remind everyone, if you have further questions about inflammatory bowel disease, please feel free to contact our IBD Help Center. You can email us at info@crohnscolitisfoundation.org or call 1-888-MY-GUT-PAIN. You can always contact us for any additional questions about COVID-19, vaccines, and inflammatory bowel disease. So with that, I want to thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Bye. Thank you.